The rain didn't just fall. It roared a relentless beast, pounding the weathered walls of the Tide's End Inn in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a sickly green glow through the cracked window of the only room left in the place. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and sea salt. The lone oil lamp on the rickety table spitting a feeble golden light that barely held back the darkness. Leonard Carter stood by the door, his Hugo Boss suit clinging to his frame, rain dripping from his dark hair onto the hardwood floor. His sharp blue eyes, usually cold as a winter sea, flickered with irritation as he surveyed the cramped space, a frayed double bed, a sagging sofa, and a woman who was already getting under his skin. Elena Brooks stood across the room, her soaked jacket slung over the sofa, her thin cotton t-shirt clinging to her curves like a second skin. Her brown skin glistened under the lamplight, and her curly hair, heavy with rainwater, framed her face in a wild halo. She crossed her arms, her deep brown eyes locking onto Leonard with a defiance that made the air crackle. "This ain't your fancy. Charleston office, Mr. Carter," she said, her southern drawl sharp with challenge. "I need a dry spot just as much as you do, so don't go claiming that bed like it's your birthright." Leonard's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing around the handle of his leather suitcase. He was the CEO of Carter Enterprises, a real estate empire that stretched from Charleston to Manhattan, and he wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not by a woman in scuffed sneakers and a thrift store backpack. "I don't share," he said, his voice low, clipped, the kind that usually made employees scatter. "Take the sofa, Ms. Brooks." Elena laughed, a sound like warm honey cutting through the storm's howl. "Share, honey. You're lucky I ain't kicking you out to sleep with the seagulls." She stepped closer, her sneakers squeaking on the wet floor, her eyes never leaving his. "Storm. Don't care if you're a big shot. We're stuck here, so deal with it." The room felt smaller, the air heavier as their gazes clashed. The rain hammered the window, a primal rhythm that matched the sudden thump of Leonard's heart. He wasn't used to this, someone who didn't flinch under his stare, someone whose presence filled the room like a tide. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat as Elena turned to grab her backpack. Her movements fluid, the damp fabric of her shirt outlining every curve. His eyes lingered a moment too long, and he cursed himself, forcing his gaze to the flickering lamp. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was on a flight from Charleston to New York, finalizing a deal for a luxury resort, when the pilot announced an emergency landing in Myrtle Beach due to a monstrous storm tearing through the Carolinas. The airport, a chaotic mess of stranded passengers and flooded runways, had left him with no choice but to trek through the rain to this rundown inn. His driver was stuck miles away, his phone signal dead, and now he was trapped in the shoebox of a room with a woman who looked like she could chew him up and spit him out without breaking a sweat. Elena, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle. Her hands trembled as she rummaged through her backpack, pulling out a cracked phone to check for a signal. She'd taken this delivery gig in Myrtle Beach for double pay, a chance to cover rent and buy Ethan new sneakers. Leaving her 6-year-old son with Miss Ruby back in Wilmington had been hard enough. But now, with the plane grounded and the storm raging, all she could think about was getting home to him. The innkeeper, a gruff woman named Mabel, had sized them up with a smirk and said, "1 room, 1 bed, 1 sofa. Y'all figure it out, 'cause ain't nobody going nowhere in this mess." Elena wasn't about to let some slick CEO push her around. No matter how his piercing eyes made her stomach flip, she glanced at him now, catching the way he stood, all coiled tension like a panther ready to pounce. His suit, even soaked, screamed money, and his voice carried the crisp edge of someone used to giving orders. But there was something else in his eyes, a shadow, a flicker of pain that made her pause. She shook it off, focusing on her phone. No signal. "Damn it," she muttered, her fingers tightening around the device. "Problem. Leonard asked, his tone dry, almost mocking, as he set his suitcase on the bed. Elena shot him a look. Yeah, you taking up space like you own the place. Move your fancy bag, Carter. He raised an eyebrow, a ghost of a smirk tugging at his lips. You're bold for someone who's dripping all over the floor, and you're bold for thinking I care about your opinion, she fired back, stepping closer to the bed. The lamp's flame danced, casting shadows that played across her face, and Leonard's breath hitched. She was close now. Too close, the scent of lavender from her damp hair mingling with the salty tang of the storm. He should have stepped back, should have reclaimed control, but his feet stayed rooted, his eyes locked on hers. The tension snapped like a taut wire when Elena reached for her backpack, her arm brushing against his. The contact was electric, a jolt that made her gasp softly, her lips parting. Leonard's hand shot out instinctively, catching her wrist, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between them. The rain's roar faded, replaced by the thud of their pulses, the warmth of her skin under his fingers. Her t-shirt clung to her, outlining every curve, and his gaze dropped unbidden to the rise and fall of her chest. Don't, she whispered, her voice husky, a warning laced with something else, something that made his blood hum. Don't, what? He murmured, his voice rough, his thumb grazing her wrist. The lamp's light flickered, painting her in gold, and he felt the pull like a tide dragging him under. Her eyes, deep and unyielding, held his, and for a moment he forgot who he was, forgot the empire, the pain, the walls he'd built. Don't look at me like you're starving, she said, but her voice trembled, betraying the heat in her gaze. They were inches apart now, her breath warm against his cheek, the air thick with unspoken want. His hand slid up her arm, slow, deliberate, and she didn't pull away. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing in that room. Every nerve alight, every sound, the creak of the floor, the drip of rain, amplified. Then a clatter. The cup she'd been holding slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp crack, splashing water across Leonard's polished leather shoes. The spell broke, and Elena stepped back, her laugh sharp and teasing. Oops, she said, not sounding sorry at all. Guess those fancy shoes ain't waterproof. Leonard stared at the puddle, then at her, his jaw clenching. Do you know how much these cost? He growled, snatching a napkin from the table to wipe them. They're custom from Milan. Elena shrugged her smile. Wicked. Water's free, Carter. You'll live. She bent to pick up the cup, her movements deliberately slow, and he couldn't help but notice the way her shirt shifted, revealing a sliver of skin at her waist. He turned away, cursing under his breath, his heart pounding like he'd run a marathon. She was trouble, this woman, bold, unapologetic, with a fire that both infuriated and drew him in. He wasn't here for this. For her. 5 years ago, his wife and son Michael were taken from him in a car bomb meant to send a message from a rival. Since then, he'd buried his heart-built walls of steel and trusted only money and power. This storm, this woman was just a glitch, a fleeting distraction. He'd be back in Charleston by morning, back to his world of glass towers and boardrooms. But Elena wasn't done with him. She sank onto the sofa, pulling out her phone again, her fingers shaking as she tried to call Miss Ruby. The signal was gone, and her face fell a crack in her armor. Ethan's fine, she muttered, more to herself than to him. He's with Miss Ruby. He's got to be fine. Leonard glanced at her, his irritation softening against his will. Ethan, he asked, his voice quieter now. My son, she said, her eyes distant, fixed on the window where lightning tore the sky. He's 6. All I got in this world. Her voice broke just a fraction, and she covered it with a forced smile. You wouldn't get it, Carter. You probably got people waiting on you hand and foot. He didn't reply, his throat tight. He did get it more than she knew. Michael's laugh, his tiny hand in Leonard's, flashed through his mind, and he turned away, gripping the edge of the table. "You're loud," he said, his voice colder than he meant a shield against the memories. Elena's eyes narrowed. "And you're a jackass, but I ain't complaining. But I—" She stood pacing the small room, her sneakers leaving wet prints. The lamp's flame wavered, casting her shadow across the wall, and Leonard watched her, unable to look away. She was a force, a storm in her own right, and he was caught in her pull. The power flickered out completely, plunging the room into near darkness. The lamp's weak glow, the only anchor. Elena froze, her breath hitching great. She muttered, fumbling for the matches Mabel had left. Her hand brushed Leonard's as she reached for the table, and both flinched, the touch sparking like a live wire. "Sorry," she said, too quick, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't be," he said, surprising himself. His hand lingered near hers, the warmth of her skin, a contrast to the cold rain seeping through the window. The darkness pressed in, intimate, forcing them to confront each other. Elena struck a match, the flare illuminating her face, exhausted, resolute, beautiful. She lit the lamp, her fingers steady despite the storm's fury, and looked at him, her eyes softer now, searching. "You got a kid?" she asked, her voice gentle, like she'd seen the shadow in his eyes. He hesitated, the words heavy. "I did," he said finally, his voice raw. "Not anymore." Her face softened, but she didn't push. Instead, she sat on the floor, hugging her knees, and started humming a gospel tune, low and haunting like a prayer against the storm. The sound wrapped around Leonard, easing the ache in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir, something he'd thought was long dead. The rain pounded on the wind, rattling the window like it wanted to break in. But in that cramped room, a different kind of storm was brewing. Leonard sank onto the sofa, his eyes on Elena, her voice weaving through the darkness. He didn't know. Her didn't want to. But as the night stretched on, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this woman was about to change everything. Hey, Soul Stories family. Can you feel the heat of that storm brewing between Leonard and Elena? If this sizzling start has you hooked, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with your thoughts. Let's keep the love and drama rolling. Don't miss what's coming next. The salty tang of the Atlantic hung heavy in the air as Elena Brooks pushed through the swinging doors of Coastal Soul, a cozy diner tucked along the waterfront in Wilmington, North Carolina. The morning sun filtered through the checkered curtains, casting golden patches on the worn linoleum floor, and the sizzle of bacon mingled with the low hum of a soul tune drifting from the old jukebox. Elena tied her apron with practiced ease, her curly hair pulled into a high bun, her brown eyes scanning the room for her first customers. It had been 6 weeks since that stormy night in Myrtle Beach. 6 weeks since she'd stood toe-to-toe with Leonard Carter in that cramped inn, his piercing blue eyes burning into hers. She'd pushed him out of her mind, or tried to. Life didn't give her time to dwell on arrogant CEOs with haunted gazes. Ethan needed new shoes, rent was due, and her 3 jobs waitressing here, delivering packages, and now a part-time gig at a construction office kept her running from dawn to dusk. But Leonard Carter wasn't the kind to be forgotten. Across town, in a makeshift office near Wilmington's sandy beaches, he sat at the head of a folding table, his tailored navy suit a stark contrast to the peeling paint and cluttered blueprints around him. The office, a temporary hub for Carter Enterprises' affordable housing project, smelled of sawdust and coffee, the hum of a distant crane filtering through the open window. Leonard's sharp gaze swept over the nervous project managers, his voice cutting like a blade. "I want updates, not excuses. This project launches in 3 months, and I don't tolerate delays." His team nodded, heads bowed, but his mind wasn't fully there. It kept drifting back to that night. The rain, the lamplight, the way Elena's voice, soft with gospel, had cracked something inside him he'd thought was long dead. He'd come to Wilmington to oversee the housing project, a strategic move to boost his company's image after a string of luxury developments. It was business, nothing more. But as he scanned the room, his breath caught. The door swung open, and there she was. Elena, a stack of files in her arms, her green button-up slightly wrinkled, her sneakers scuffing the floor. Her eyes met his, and for a split second the world tilted. Then her lips curved into a smirk, that same defiant spark from Myrtle Beach. "Well, damn," she said, her southern drawl thick with amusement. "Ain't this just my luck? You stalking me now, Carter?" The room went quiet, the managers exchanging puzzled glances. Leonard's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, amusement maybe, or heat. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice cool, urban. "I don't stalk. I work. What are you doing here?" "Working?" "Obviously," she shot back, dropping the files on the table with a thud. "Somebody's got to keep this place running while y'all sit around talking big." She crossed her arms, her gaze challenging, and the air crackled with the same tension that had filled that inn. Her shirt hugged her frame, and Leonard's eyes dipped just for a moment before he forced them back to her face. He wasn't here for this, for her. But his pulse said otherwise. Malik Turner. Leonard's right-hand man and the project's operations director leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. A tall man with a close-cropped beard and a knack for cutting through Leonard's icy facade, Malik was one of the few who dared tease him. "Well, well," he said, his voice rich with humor. "Looks like we got some history walking in. Care to share, boss?" "Focus," Malik Leonard snapped, but his tone lacked its usual bite. He stood smoothing his tie, trying to reclaim control. "Ms. Brooks, these files better be organized." "They are," Elena said, unfazed. "Unlike your attitude." A soft chuckle rippled through the room, quickly stifled under Leonard's glare. She turned to leave, her hips swaying just enough to make him swallow hard, and he cursed himself for noticing. This was a job site, not a bar. He was Leonard Carter, not some lovesick fool. But as the door swung shut behind her, he felt the pull, like a tide dragging him back to that stormy night. By noon, Elena was back at Coastal Soul, pouring coffee for a table of fishermen, their laughter mixing with the clink of plates and the smoky scent of gumbo simmering in the kitchen. Tasha, her best friend and fellow waitress, sidled up, her braids swinging as she nudged Elena's hip. "Girl, you look like you seen a ghost," Tasha said, her eyes twinkling. "What's got you all shook up?" "Nothing," Elena lied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just a long day." "Uh-huh," Tasha said, unconvinced. "This got something to do with that fancy man you mentioned from Myrtle Beach, the one with the shoes you ruined." She grinned, dodging Elena's playful swat. "Spill, Elena. You know I'll get it out of you." Elena sighed, glancing out the window at the sun-glinting waves. "He's here, Tasha. Showed up at the project office like he owns the damn place. Which I guess he kinda does." Tasha's eyes widened. "The CEO. Oh, honey, you in trouble. Is he as fine as you said?" "Fine. Don't mean nothing when he's a jackass," Elena said. But her cheeks warmed, betraying her. She could still feel his hand on her wrist, the heat of his gaze in that inn. She shook her head, focusing on the coffee pot. Ethan was her world, her 6-year-old with a gap-toothed grin and a love for superheroes. She didn't have time for men like Leonard Carter, men who lived in a world of glass towers and private jets, worlds that didn't mix with hers. But the universe had other plans. That afternoon, as Elena sorted files in the project office, the door burst open, and Ethan bounded in his backpack, bouncing his sneakers caked with sand. "Mama," he shouted, throwing his arms around her. "School let out early." Miss Ruby said, "I could come see you." Elena's heart melted, her exhaustion fading as she hugged him tight. "Hey, baby, you been good for Miss Ruby." Her eyes flicked to the door where Leonard stood, watching the scene with an unreadable expression. Ethan followed her gaze, his brown eyes mirror images of hers lighting up. "Who's that, Mama?" "He got a superhero car." Leonard froze his usual composure, faltering. Kids were a sore spot, a reminder of Michael of the life he'd lost. "I don't do superhero cars," he said. His voice clipped, but Ethan was undeterred, darting closer. "You look like Iron Man," Ethan said, grinning. "You fight bad guys." Leonard's lips twitched a ghost of a smile. Something like that. He glanced at Elena, who was watching him with a mix of wariness and curiosity, and something in his chest tightened. This wasn't his world, messy, loud, full of life, but it was hers, and it drew him in like a moth to a flame. The tension escalated when a project engineer, a wiry man named Carl with a sneer, sauntered in his eyes, raking over Elena. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You here to fetch coffee or something? Girls like you always know how to please the boss, right?" The words carried a nasty edge, a jab at her race and status, and the room went still. Elena's spine stiffened, her voice ice cold. "I'm here to work, Carl, not to deal with your sorry ass. Keep talking and you'll be fetching your own damn job." Her eyes blazed, and Leonard, who'd been silent, stepped forward, his presence like a storm cloud. "Get out," Leonard said, his voice low, lethal. Carl opened his mouth, then thought better of it, scurrying away under Leonard's glare. The room exhaled, but Elena turned on him, her hands on her hips. "I don't need you fighting my battles, Carter," she said, her voice sharp. "I've been handling men like that since I was 16. I'm not fighting your battles," Leonard said, his eyes locked on hers. "I'm keeping my sight in order." But his tone softened, and for a moment they stood there, the air thick with unspoken words. Her closeness, the fire in her eyes, stirred something in him, something dangerous, something he couldn't afford. That evening at Coastal Soul, Elena was wiping down tables when Leonard walked in. His suit jacket slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened. The diner was quiet. The last customer's gone, and Tasha was in the back, singing along to Aretha Franklin. The jukebox glowed, casting a warm amber light, and the smell of coffee and cornbread lingered in the air. Elena froze, her heart kicking up a notch. "You lost Carter?" she asked, her tone teasing but wary. "Thought I'd try the coffee," he said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Unless you're planning to spill it on me this time." She laughed, a sound that hit him like a shot of bourbon. "Keep talking and I might." She poured him a cup, her fingers brushing his as she slid it across the counter. The touch was fleeting, but it ignited a spark, and their eyes locked, the air between them charged. The jukebox shifted to a slow Otis Redding tune, the notes wrapping around them like a warm embrace, and Elena leaned closer, her voice low. "You ain't here for coffee, are you?" Leonard's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, his voice rough. "Maybe I'm here to figure you out. Brooks." Her shirt was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the curve of her collarbone, and he felt the pull, the same heat from that night in the inn. She stepped closer, her breath warm, her eyes daring him to cross the line. "You think you can handle me?" she whispered, her voice a sultry challenge, the words vibrating in the quiet diner. The light caught her skin, making it glow like polished mahogany, and Leonard's hand twitched, itching to reach for her. Their faces were inches apart, the scent of her lavender shampoo mingling with the coffee, the music a heartbeat in the background. His fingers grazed her wrist, slow, deliberate, and she didn't pull away, her breath hitching. "Careful," he murmured, his voice a low growl. "You're playing with fire and you're burning up, Carter," she shot back, but her voice trembled, betraying the heat in her gaze. The moment stretched taut, electric, until Tasha's voice broke the spell, calling from the kitchen. "Elena? You locking up or what?" Elena stepped back, her laugh shaky, breaking the tension. "Get your coffee and go." "Carter," she said, but her eyes lingered, promising more. Leonard took a sip, the bitterness grounding him, and stood, leaving a 20 on the counter. "Keep the change," he said, his voice steady, but his heart was racing as he walked out into the cool night air. Outside, the waves lapped at the shore, and Leonard paused, glancing back at the diner's glowing windows. Elena was trouble a storm he couldn't outrun. But as he drove back to his hotel, her laugh, her touch, her fire burned in his mind, and he knew he'd be back in Wilmington tomorrow. Not for the project, but for her. The Wilmington sunset bled orange and pink across the horizon, painting the sandy beaches in hues that made the world feel softer. If only for a moment. Elena Brooks stood at the edge of the shore, the cool Atlantic breeze tugging at her green sundress, her bare feet sinking into the damp sand. The rhythmic crash of waves was a lullaby, almost drowning out the chaos of her thoughts. It had been 2 weeks since Leonard Carter walked into coastal Seoul, his blue eyes locking onto hers over a cup of coffee, his touch igniting a fire she wasn't ready to face. She told herself to forget him, his Charleston suits, his guarded smiles, his world that didn't belong to hers. But he kept showing up at the project office, at the diner, his presence like a tide pulling her under. She glanced down the beach where Ethan and his friend Jaden were chasing seagulls, their laughter carrying over the wind. Ethan's sneakers, patched with duct tape, kicked up sand, and Jaden's oversized t-shirt flapped like a flag. Elena smiled, her heart swelling, but it was a fragile moment. Rent was late again, her delivery gig was cutting hours, and the project office job, though steady, wasn't enough to keep the wolf from the door. She'd do anything for Ethan. Work 3 jobs, skip meals, lie awake worrying, but the weight was crushing her, and Leonard Carter, with his quiet gestures and burning gazes, was making it harder to stay focused. Across town, in the temporary project office near Wilmington's port, Leonard Carter leaned over a blueprint. His tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. The office smelled of sawdust and salt, the hum of construction outside a constant drone. Malik Turner sat across from him, flipping through a report, his dark eyes glinting with mischief. "You're distracted, man," Malik said, his voice rich with amusement. "And I'm betting it's that firecracker from the diner, Elena." "Right?" Leonard's jaw tightened, his pen pausing mid-signature. "I'm focused," he said, his voice clipped urban, the kind that shut down boardrooms. But Malik wasn't his boardroom. He was his oldest friend, the one who'd seen him through the darkest days after the car bomb that took his wife and son Michael, the one who knew the walls Leonard had built weren't just for show. "Uh-huh," Malik said, leaning back. "That's why you're driving to Wilmington every other day when you could send me. She's got you shook, Carter." He grinned, dodging the pen. Leonard tossed at him. "Just saying she ain't like the suits you deal with. She's real. You ready for that?" Leonard didn't answer, his gaze drifting to the window where the fading light reflected off the water. Real. That was the problem. Elena was too real, her laugh, her defiance, the way she sang gospel to calm her son's fears. She was a storm in human form, and he was caught in her orbit, unable to break free. He told himself it was just curiosity, a fleeting spark from that night in Myrtle Beach. But every time he saw her, every time her eyes challenged him, the spark grew into something he couldn't name, something that scared him, more than any business rival. The conflict erupted that afternoon at the project office. Elena was sorting files, her fingers deft, despite the exhaustion in her eyes, when Raymond Holt, a rival developer with a shark smile, strode in. His gray suit was impeccable, his voice smooth as oil, but his eyes were cold, predatory. "Carter," he said, ignoring Elena, "your little charity project's cute, but it's bleeding money. Pull out now or I'll make sure it tanks." Leonard stood, his presence filling the room. "Threats don't work on me, Holt," he said, his voice low, lethal. You should know that by now. Holt's gaze slid to Elena, lingering too long. Maybe not, he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. But I bet your new assistant here knows how to persuade you. Girls like her always do. The words were a jab laced with racial venom, and Elena's hand froze on the files, her spine stiffening. She turned, her eyes blazing. You got something to say? Say it to my face. She snapped her southern drawl, sharp as a blade. I'm here to work, not to play your nasty games. Holt smirked, unfazed. Feisty. I like that. Leonard stepped forward, his voice a growl. Get out, Holt. Now, the air crackled with tension, and Holt raised his hands in mock surrender, sauntering out with a chuckle that promised trouble. The room exhaled, but Elena rounded on Leonard, her hands on her hips. I don't need you playing knight in shining armor, she said, her voice sharp. I've been handling creeps like him my whole life. I'm not playing anything, Leonard said, his eyes locked on hers. I won't let trash like that disrespect my team. His words were steady, but his gaze was intense, searching, and Elena felt a flush creep up her neck. He was too close, his cologne a mix of cedar and bourbon, mixing with the salty air, and she hated how it made her heart race. She turned away, muttering, Whatever, Carter. But the moment lingered heavy with unspoken things. That evening, as she walked home with Ethan, she couldn't shake the image of Leonard's eyes, the way he'd stood up for her, not out of pity, but something deeper. The turning point came a week later, under the fading light of a Wilmington sunset. Elena was at the beach again, watching Ethan and Jaden build a sandcastle when she got a call from her landlord. Miss Brooks, I got a payment for 3 months' rent, he said, his voice puzzled. Came through some charity fund. You know anything about this? Elena's blood ran cold. She knew. She hung up her hands, shaking, and marched to the project office where Leonard was working late, the glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across his angular face. What the hell did you do? She demanded, slamming the door behind her. The room smelled of coffee and blueprints, the hum of a distant generator, the only sound. Leonard looked up, his expression unreadable. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, she said, her voice rising. You paid my rent, Carter. I told you I don't need your charity. He stood his height, imposing, but his voice was calm, almost soft. It wasn't charity. Elena, I saw you struggling and I wanted you and Ethan safe. That's all. Safe. She laughed bitter, stepping closer, her eyes blazing. You think you can swoop in and fix my life? I'm not some project for you to manage. The air between them crackled, the sunset streaming through the window, bathing them in gold. Leonard's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, his voice rough. I'm not trying to fix you. I'm trying to keep you here with me. The words hung there, raw, unguarded, and Elena's breath caught her anger faltering. They were inches apart now, the heat of their bodies mingling, the scent of her lavender shampoo wrapping around him. His hand reached out, grazing her arm, slow, deliberate, and she didn't pull away. You drive me crazy, Brooks, he murmured, his voice a low growl, his fingers trailing up to her shoulder. The touch was fire, and Elena's heart pounded, her resolve crumbling. Don't do this, she whispered, but her voice was shaky, her eyes locked on his. The waves outside roared a primal rhythm that matched the thud of their pulses. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and she gasped, her hands pressing against his chest, feeling the hard planes beneath his shirt. The room spun the sunset's glow, making her skin shimmer, and for a moment they were lost in each other, the world reduced to the heat of their breath, the electric pull of their bodies. You're gonna break me? Carter, she said, her voice barely audible, but she didn't push him away. His lips hovered near hers. The air between them charged, and she felt the pull like a tide. She couldn't fight. They were on the edge, ready to fall, when a seagull's cry outside snapped them back. Elena stepped back, her laugh shaky, breaking the spell. "We can't," she said, her eyes glistening. "Not like this." Leonard let her go, his hands falling to his sides, his chest heaving. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I didn't mean to. Don't." She cut him off, turning away, her heart racing. "Just don't." She left the door swinging shut behind her, leaving Leonard alone in the fading light, the weight of her words sinking in. The real storm hit 2 nights later. Elena was at home, a small apartment above a laundromat, the smell of detergent and gumbo lingering in the air. Ethan was curled up on the couch, his face flushed, his breath shallow. "Mama, I don't feel good," he whimpered, and Elena's heart clenched. She checked his forehead, burning. Panic surged as she rummaged for medicine, finding only expired Tylenol. She called for a taxi, but the storm outside, a howling beast of rain and wind, had shut down the roads. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, tears streaming as she held him close, her phone trembling in her hand. Then it buzzed. A strange number. She answered, her voice shaking. "Hello? Where are you?" Leonard's voice, urgent, cut through the static. "Elena, where are you?" She froze, stunned. "How? Why are you calling me?" "Tell me where you are," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Stammering, she gave her address, and within 20 minutes, headlights pierced the rain, a sleek black Bentley pulling up outside. Leonard burst through the door. His coat drenched his hair, plastered to his forehead. Without a word, he scooped Ethan up, his voice gentle but firm. "Get in the car." Elena didn't argue, rushing after him, her heart pounding. The drive to MUSC Hospital in Charleston was a blur, the rain lashing the windshield, the wipers a frantic heartbeat. Leonard's hands gripped the wheel, his eyes locked on the road, navigating the flooded streets with a focus that bordered on feral. Ethan whimpered in Elena's arms, and she sang a gospel tune, her voice trembling but steady, a lifeline in the dark. At the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the hum of fluorescent lights replaced the storm's roar. Leonard carried Ethan into the ER, barking at the nurses. "Do something now." The doctor examined him, administering medicine and an IV, assuring them it was just a high fever, manageable with a night's observation. Elena sat by Ethan's bed, holding his hand, her eyes red but resolute. Leonard didn't leave, slumping into a hard plastic chair, his soaked shoes squeaking on the linoleum, his gaze fixed on them. Late that night, Ethan stirred, his voice weak. "Mama, I'm thirsty." Leonard fumbled with a cup of water, spilling half of it before handing it over, and Ethan giggled faintly. "You're bad at this, Mr. Iron Man." Leonard's lips twitched a rare smile. "I'm not used to this superhero stuff, kid." He glanced at Elena, who was watching him, her eyes soft, unguarded. She reached out her hand, finding his, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For coming." He squeezed her hand, his voice low, rough. "I couldn't stay away." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled between them. A promise neither was ready to name. The storm outside raged on, but in that hospital room under the harsh lights, something shifted, a crack in Leonard's walls, a spark in Elena's heart. They sat there, hands entwined, as Ethan drifted back to sleep. The world outside, fading to a distant roar. The Wilmington night was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked jasmine, The air thick as Elena Brooks stood on her apartment's tiny balcony, gripping the rusted railing. Below the laundromat's neon sign buzzed, casting a pink glow across the cracked pavement. Inside, Ethan slept on the couch, his superhero comic book splayed across his chest. His soft snores a fragile anchor in the chaos of her thoughts. It had been 3 days since Leonard Carter had driven through a storm to get her son to the hospital. 3 days since his hand had held hers in that sterile room. His voice promising something she wasn't ready to believe. She wanted to hate him. His money, his control, the way he'd paid her rent behind her back. But she couldn't. Not when his eyes, shadowed with pain, had looked at her like she was the only thing keeping him afloat. In Charleston, Leonard sat in his sleek office atop Carter Enterprises' glass tower, the city's historic skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room smelled of polished wood and bourbon. The faint jazz notes of Coltrane drifting from a hidden speaker. His tie was undone, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a glimpse of the hard lines beneath. He stared at a photo on his desk. Michael, his son, laughing in a park, his tiny hand clutching a kite. The memory was a knife twisting deeper every time he thought of Ethan, of Elena, of the life he'd sworn never to want again. He poured another shot of bourbon, the burn grounding him, but it couldn't drown out her voice, her laugh, the way her touch had set him ablaze on that beach. Malik Turner's knock broke the silence, his broad frame filling the doorway. "You look like hell, man," Malik said, his voice laced with concern. He crossed the room, sinking into a leather chair, his eyes sharp. "What's eating you? The project's on track, but you're out here acting like the world's ending." Leonard swirled the bourbon, his gaze distant. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice was rough, betraying him. Malik wasn't fooled. He'd been there 5 years ago when the car bomb ordered by Raymond Holt, though never proven, had ripped Leonard's family apart. He'd watched Leonard rebuild himself into a machine cold and untouchable, but now something was cracking. "It's her." "Ain't it?" Malik said, leaning forward. "Elena. She's got you twisted up and you're scared as hell." Leonard's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the glass. "I'm not scared," he lied. But the words felt hollow. He was terrified not of Holt, not of losing his empire, but of letting Elena and Ethan in, of loving them and failing them like he'd failed Michael. "She's just a distraction," Malik snorted. "Distraction, man. She's a hurricane and you're caught in the eye. Don't push her away, 'cause you're too damn stubborn to feel something again." Leonard didn't answer. His gaze drifting to the city lights. Malik was right, and that was the problem. Every time he saw Elena, her fierce eyes, her gospel hum, the way she fought for her son, he felt the walls he'd built crumbling. But Holt's threat loomed a shadow from the past. Malik had dug up rumors Holt was linked to the bomb, and now he was circling, sniffing for weakness. If Leonard got too close to Elena, to Ethan, they could become targets. He couldn't let that happen. Not again. Back in Wilmington, Elena was wrestling with her own demons. At Coastal Soul, she poured coffee for a table of dock workers, their banter a familiar hum, but her mind was elsewhere. Tasha, wiping down the counter, caught her staring out the window at the gray waves. "Girl, you been mooning all week?" Tasha said, her braids swinging as she leaned in. "This about that hospital night? You and Mr. Fancy got something going on." Elena sighed, her hands busy with a rag. "Ain't nothing going on, Tasha. He's just complicated. Complicated's code for he's got you hot and bothered," Tasha teased, dodging Elena's swat. "Look, I ain't saying jump in head first, but don't let fear keep you from living. You deserve more than just surviving." Elena's throat tightened. She'd loved before Ethan's father lost in a car crash when she was pregnant. She'd learned to guard her heart, to trust only herself. But Leonard was different, slipping past her defenses with his quiet strength, his clumsy kindness. She saw it in the way he'd carried Ethan, the way he'd stayed in that hospital chair, his eyes never leaving them. But he was pulling back now, his visits to Wilmington less frequent, his texts curt. She didn't know if it was fear or something worse, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. The conflict boiled over at the project office where Elena was filing reports under the hum of a flickering fluorescent light. Raymond Holt strode in, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete floor, his smile sharp as a blade. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice syrupy. "You're wasted on this dump. A woman like you could do better. Say with someone who knows how to play the game." His eyes raked over her, a mix of lust and disdain, and Elena's skin crawled. She stood, her voice ice cold. "I don't play games. Holt and I sure as hell don't need your kind of better. Get out." Her hands trembled, but her gaze was steady, a fire that made Holt's smile falter. He leaned closer, his voice low. "Careful, sweetheart. You're playing with the big boys now. And Carter can't protect you forever." The threat hung heavy, and Elena's heart raced, but she didn't flinch, her eyes boring into his until he turned and left, his laugh echoing. Leonard arrived minutes later, summoned by a frantic call from Malik. He found Elena at her desk, her face composed, but her hands shaking. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice tight, his eyes scanning her for any sign of harm. "Holt," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "Thinks he can scare me? I handled it." Leonard's fists clenched, his voice a growl. "He's dangerous. Elena, stay away from him. I don't need you telling me how to live," she snapped, standing, her eyes blazing. "I've been fighting my own battles since before you showed up. Carter." The air between them crackled, the office's stale air thick with tension. His cologne cedar and bourbon mixed with the scent of her lavender shampoo, and she hated how it made her pulse race even now. "I'm not trying to control you," he said, stepping closer, his voice low, raw. "I'm trying to keep you safe." His eyes searched hers, and she saw it. The fear, the pain, the same shadow she'd glimpsed in Myrtle Beach. It softened her just enough to let him in. The breaking point came that night. Elena was locking up Coastal Soul. The diner quiet, except for the patter of rain on the roof. The jukebox had gone silent, the air heavy with the smell of coffee and cornbread. She was alone, or so she thought, until the door creaked open, and Leonard stepped in his black coat, drenched his hair plastered to his forehead. The rain followed him, a cold whisper against the warm glow of the diner's lights, and Elena froze, her heart kicking up a notch. "What are you doing here?" "Carter," she asked, her voice wary, but her eyes betrayed her, lingering on the way his shirt clung to his chest, the hard lines of his body outlined by the wet fabric. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice rough, unguarded. He stepped closer, the door swinging shut, cutting off the storm's howl. "Holt's not just a rival, Elena. He's the one who—" He stopped, his throat working, the words too heavy. "I can't lose you. Not like I lost them." Her breath caught the weight of his confession sinking in. She saw the boy in his eyes, the one who'd lost everything, and her walls cracked. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said, her voice trembling, stepping closer until they were inches apart. "You don't get to walk away, 'cause you're scared." "I'm not walking away," he said, his hands reaching for her, pulling her into him. The contact was electric, a spark that set them ablaze. His lips crashed into hers, a kiss that was all hunger and desperation. The rain on his skin cold against her warmth. She kissed him back, fierce, her hands fisting in his shirt, the world narrowing to the heat of their bodies, the thud of their hearts. The diner's lights flickered, casting their shadows across the wall, and the rain's rhythm matched the frantic beat of their breaths. His hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and she gasped against his mouth, the sound swallowed by the storm. "You're gonna ruin me," she whispered, her voice husky, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. His lips grazed her neck, a slow, deliberate burn, and she shivered, her body arching into his. "Then let me," he murmured, his voice, a low growl, his hands tightening on her hips. The kiss deepened, a dance of need and fear, and for a moment they were lost. The storm outside, a distant echo. But reality clawed its way back, and Elena pulled away, her chest heaving, her eyes glistening. "We can't," she said, her voice breaking. "Not if you're gonna run when it gets hard." She stepped back, the space between them, cold, unbearable. "I got Ethan to think about. I can't let him love you if you're gonna leave." Leonard's face crumpled, his hands falling to his sides. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice raw. "But I don't know how to do this, how to be what you need." "Then figure it out," she said, her eyes fierce, tears spilling over. "Or don't come back." She turned, grabbing her jacket, and walked out into the rain, leaving him standing in the diner, the echo of her words louder than the storm. He drove back to Charleston that night, the rain blurring the windshield. His heart, a tangled mess. In his office, he sank into his chair, the bourbon bottle untouched. Elena's face burned into his mind, her fire, her pain, her kiss. He'd tried to protect her by pulling away, but all he'd done was hurt her, and the realization cut deeper than any loss. Holt's shadow loomed, a threat he couldn't ignore, but it was Elena's words that haunted him. Figure it out. In Wilmington, Elena sat by Ethan's side watching him sleep, her tears silent. She'd pushed Leonard away, but the ache in her chest told her she'd fallen hard, reckless for a man who might break her. The rain pounded on a mirror to her heart, and she whispered a gospel prayer, hoping for strength, for clarity, for a way to navigate the storm they'd both unleashed. The Wilmington. Dawn broke gray and heavy, the air thick with the promise of rain. Elena Brooks stood in her cramped kitchen, the smell of burnt toast mingling with the faint tang of laundry detergent drifting up from the laundromat below. She stirred a pot of oatmeal for Ethan, her hands moving on autopilot, but her mind was a storm. It had been a week since she'd walked out of Coastal Seoul, leaving Leonard Carter in the rain-soaked diner, his kiss still burning on her lips. She'd told him to figure it out or stay away, but the silence that followed was deafening. No calls, no visits, just the ache in her chest that grew sharper every time Ethan asked, "Where's Mr. Iron Man, Mama?" She'd pushed him away to protect her son, to protect herself, but the emptiness felt like a betrayal of her own heart. In Charleston, Leonard sat in his office, the city's historic spires shrouded in mist beyond the glass. The room was dark, the jazz record he usually played silent, the only sound the faint creak of his leather chair as he leaned forward, elbows on his desk. A manila folder lay open before him, its contents, a gut punch, emails, bank records, a grainy photo of a man who'd haunted him for 5 years. Raymond Holt, Malik Turner, had spent weeks digging, and the evidence was damning. Holt hadn't just been a rival. He'd orchestrated the car bomb that killed Leonard's wife and son Michael, a calculated strike to cripple him. The truth was a blade slicing through the walls he'd built, but it wasn't the only thing cutting him. Elena's face, her fierce eyes, her trembling voice haunted him more than Holt ever could. Malik stood by the window, his arms crossed, his voice low. "We got him, Leonard," he said, his eyes steady. "This is enough to bury Holt, cops, feds, the whole 9 yards. But you gotta decide what you're fighting for, the past or something new." He paused, his gaze softening. "She's worth it, man. You know she is." Leonard's hand tightened around the photo of Michael, his knuckles white. He'd spent years running from pain, building an empire to shield himself. But Elena and Ethan had slipped past his defenses, their warmth melting the ice in his heart. He'd pushed her away, thinking it would keep them safe, but all he'd done was hurt them. Malik's words echoed. Something new. He wanted it. Her laugh. Ethan's grin. A life that wasn't just survival, but Holt was still out there, a predator circling, and Leonard knew he couldn't move forward until he faced the past. Back in Wilmington, Elena was at Coastal Soul pouring coffee for a table of regulars, their chatter a dull hum against her racing thoughts. Tasha leaned against the counter, her braids swinging as she studied Elena. "You look like you ain't slept in a week, girl," she said, her voice soft but pointed. "This about that man. You pushed him away, but you're missing him, ain't you?" Elena sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "I don't know, Tasha. He's got his own demons, and I can't let Ethan get caught in that mess, but—" She trailed off, her throat tight. "He showed up when I needed him. That's gotta mean something, right? Means he's trying," Tasha said, squeezing her shoulder. "But you gotta decide if you're willing to meet him halfway. Love's a risk." "Elena, always has been." Elena nodded, but the words felt heavy. She'd risked love before with Ethan's father and lost him to a car crash. She'd built her own walls, but Leonard's kiss, his raw confession, had cracked them. She wanted to believe in him, but fear clung to her like damp sand, and she didn't know how to shake it. The storm broke that afternoon, not just in the sky, but in Elena's world. She was walking Ethan home from school, the Wilmington streets slick with rain, when he darted ahead, chasing a stray dog. Ethan slowed down. She called her heart, lurching as he tripped, tumbling into the path of a delivery van. The screech of tires pierced the air, and Elena screamed Ethan. She ran her sneakers, slipping her breath ragged, and pulled him into her arms, his forehead bleeding, his eyes dazed. "Baby, stay with me," she whispered, tears streaming as neighbors shouted for an ambulance. At the hospital, the antiseptic smell and fluorescent hum were a cruel echo of Ethan's fever night. Elena sat by his bed holding his hand, her spirit fraying as the doctor explained a mild concussion. A few stitches, but he'd be okay with rest. Ethan woke, his voice small. "Mama, it hurts." She stroked his hair, singing a gospel tune, her voice trembling but steady. "I'm here, baby. You're gonna be fine." But his next words shattered her. "Where's Mr. Iron Man? I want him." Elena's heart broke, her fingers hovering over her phone. She wanted to call Leonard to beg him to come, but pride and fear stopped her. He'd walked away, hadn't he? She couldn't lean on someone who might vanish again, but Ethan's plea echoed, and she dialed her hands, shaking. The call went to voicemail, and she choked back a sob, whispering, "Please, Leonard, we need you. Miles away." Leonard was in his Bentley, speeding through the rain-soaked streets of Charleston, his phone dead in his pocket. He'd been meeting with a private investigator finalizing the evidence against Holt when Malik burst in his face, grim. "It's Elena," he said, thrusting his phone at Leonard Hospital, called Ethan's hurt. The world tilted, and Leonard was moving before he could think, his car tearing through the storm. The Cape Fear River, a blur of gray beyond the windshield. The rain lashed the car, the wipers a frantic pulse, but his mind was on Elena, her voice, her strength, the way she'd held Ethan in that hospital room. He'd failed. Michael failed his wife, but he wouldn't fail them. Not again. He reached MUSC Hospital in Charleston. Just as the storm peaked, the lobby's fluorescent lights harsh against his drenched coat. Elena was in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She froze when she saw him, her breath hitching. "You came," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I had to," he said, his voice raw, stepping closer. The air between them was charged, the hospital's hum fading to a distant buzz. Her sundress was rumpled, her curls loose, and she looked fragile, but her eyes were fierce, holding his like a lifeline. "How's Ethan?" "He's okay," she said, her voice trembling. "Concussion stitches, but he'll be fine. He asked for you." Tears spilled over and Leonard's chest tightened, the weight of her words hitting him like a wave. He reached for her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I'm here, Elena," he said, his voice low, fervent. "I'm not going anywhere." The words were a vow, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his, finding the truth in them. The moment broke when a nurse called her back to Ethan's room, but Leonard followed his presence. Steady grounding. Ethan was awake, his face pale, but his eyes brightening when he saw Leonard, Mr. Iron Man. He said, his voice weak, but excited. "You came?" Leonard smiled a rare, unguarded smile and sat beside him. "Told you I fight bad guys, kid," he said, his voice soft. "You're tougher than any of them." Ethan giggled, clutching his hand, and Elena watched, her heart swelling, her fears easing. Later in the hospital hallway, the storm outside had quieted, leaving only the patter of rain against the windows. Elena leaned against the wall, exhausted, and Leonard stood beside her, their shoulders brushing. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting their shadows in a soft dance, and the air smelled of antiseptic and her lavender shampoo. "Why'd you come?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes on the floor. He turned to her, his hand lifting her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Because I love you," he said, the words raw, unadorned. "And Ethan, I was wrong to walk away, Elena. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just scared. I'm done running." Her breath hitched, tears welling again. But this time, they were different. Hope, not pain. "You sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "'Cause I can't do this halfway, Leonard. Not with Ethan. Not with me." "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady, his eyes burning with resolve. He leaned in his lips, brushing her forehead, a slow, tender kiss that sent warmth flooding through her. She tilted her head, their lips meeting in a soft, lingering kiss. Not the desperate hunger of the diner, but something deeper, a promise sealed in the quiet of the hospital. His hand slid to her neck, his fingers tangling in her curls, and she melted into him, the world fading to the rhythm of their breaths, the faint hum of rain outside. "Stay," she whispered against his lips, her voice husky, her hands clutching his coat. "Don't leave us again." "I won't," he said, his forehead resting against hers, his voice a vow. The kiss deepened for a moment, a flicker of heat in the tenderness, but they pulled back, aware of the hospital's sterile walls, the weight of the moment grounding them. The external conflict surged as Leonard stepped outside to call Malik, the rain cool against his skin. "It's done," Malik said over the phone. "Feds got the evidence on Holt. He's going down. Leonard, you're free." Leonard exhaled, the weight of 5 years lifting. But it was Elena's face that filled his mind, her strength that anchored him. Holt was finished, but the real battle was here in this hospital, in the life he wanted with her and Ethan. He returned to the room, finding Elena by Ethan's side, her gospel hum soft, her eyes warm as they met his. He sat beside her, his hand finding hers, and they stayed there, a quiet strength binding them. The storm outside a distant memory, but the victory was bittersweet. Elena knew loving Leonard meant facing his world. Charleston's elite, the whispers of those who'd see her, as less the ghosts of his past. And Leonard knew loving her meant confronting his fear, his guilt every day. They were on the edge of something new, something fragile, but as their hands intertwined, they felt the spark of possibility, a light breaking through the darkness. The Wilmington night was alive with the whisper of waves, the Atlantic stretching endless and silver under a crescent moon. Elena Brooks stood on the porch of her new home, a modest beachside cottage with peeling paint and a creaky swing, the kind of place that felt like a dream after years in a cramped apartment above a laundromat. The air smelled of salt and magnolia, the faint hum of crickets blending with the ocean's lullaby. She leaned against the railing, her green sundress swaying in the breeze, her curly hair loose, catching the moonlight. It had been 3 weeks since the hospital, since Leonard Carter had knelt before her, his voice raw with love, promising to stay. She'd believed him then, and every day since he'd proven it. Not with grand gestures, but with the quiet strength of a man rebuilding his heart. Inside, Ethan was sprawled on the living room floor, his crayons scattered, his gap-toothed grin lighting up as he showed Leonard his latest drawing, a superhero in a black suit wielding a glowing sword. "That's you, Mr. Iron Man," Ethan said, his voice bubbling with excitement. Leonard, in a rare, casual look, jeans and a white t-shirt, sat cross-legged beside him, his usual CEO polish traded for a warmth that made Elena's chest ache. "Not bad, kid," he said, ruffling Ethan's hair, his deep voice tinged with a smile. "But my sword's way cooler." Elena watched from the doorway, her heart full but cautious. The cottage was theirs, bought by Leonard, but with a deal. She'd insisted on monthly payments. Her name on the deed. She wasn't a charity case, and he'd respected that. His eyes soft with pride when she'd laid down her terms. They were building something, not just a home, but a life, and it was fragile, beautiful, terrifying. She loved him, God, she did. But love came with risks, and the ghosts of their pasts still lingered, whispering doubts in the quiet moments. In Charleston, the fallout from Raymond Holt's arrest was still rippling. The feds had taken him down the evidence. Malik uncovered bank records, coded emails tying him to the car bomb that killed Leonard's family 5 years ago. The news had hit the paper's headlines screaming about corruption and vengeance. But Leonard had kept his distance, letting the law handle Holt. He'd spent too long chasing ghosts, and now with Elena and Ethan, he wanted to live, not just survive. Malik had clapped him on the shoulder, his grin wide. "You're free, man," he'd said. "Now go. Be the guy she deserves." Leonard was trying. He'd cut back on Charleston trips, delegating to Malik, and moved into a rented condo in Wilmington, close enough to be part of their daily rhythm. He was learning Ethan's world, superhero comics, sandcastles, the way the boy's eyes lit up at a good story. He was learning Elena's too, her gospel hums, her love for gumbo, the fierce pride that made her stand tall against the world. But it wasn't easy. Charleston's elite whispered about the CEO and his waitress, their glances laced with judgment, and Elena felt it, the weight of being seen as less. Leonard saw it too, and it fueled his resolve to prove them wrong, to prove he was hers, not theirs. The turning point came one evening at the cottage. The moon high, the air warm with summer's last breath. Ethan was at Miss Ruby's for a sleepover, Jaden and a pile of comic books keeping him busy. Elena was in the kitchen stirring a pot of shrimp and grits, the smell rich and comforting when Leonard walked in, his t-shirt clinging to his frame after a run on the beach. "Smells like heaven," he said, leaning against the counter, his blue eyes soft, teasing. "You gonna share, or am I eating sand tonight?" She laughed, a sound like warm honey, and swatted him with a dish towel. "Keep talking. Carter and you'll be lucky to get a cracker." Her sundress hugged her curves, and his gaze lingered, a flicker of heat that made her pulse quicken. She turned back to the stove, but his hand caught hers, pulling her gently to face him. "Dance with me," he said, his voice low, a challenge wrapped in tenderness. The radio was on a slow Otis Redding tune, filling the room, and Elena raised an eyebrow, her smile sly. "You dance?" she teased. But she let him pull her close, their bodies swaying to the music. The kitchen was small, the linoleum cool under her bare feet, but the world shrank to the heat of his hands on her waist, the rhythm of their breaths. His cologne, cedar and bourbon mixed with the salty tang of his skin, and she felt the pull, the same fire from the diner, the hospital, the beach. "You're getting better at this," she murmured, her voice husky, her hands sliding up his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heart. His lips grazed her temple, a slow burn, and she shivered, her body arching into his. "Only 'cause it's you," he said, his voice a low growl, his hands tightening on her hips. The music swelled and he spun her gently, pulling her back until their faces were inches apart, the moonlight streaming through the window, painting her skin in silver. "You're my home, Elena," he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "You and Ethan." Her heart stuttered, tears pricking her eyes, but she didn't look away. "You mean that?" she asked, her voice trembling, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "'Cause I'm all in, Leonard, but I need you to be too." "I am," he said, his eyes fierce, and he kissed her slow and deep, a kiss that was all promise and passion, her hands tangled in his hair, her body pressing closer, the heat between them building like a summer storm. His lips trailed to her neck, a deliberate tease, and she gasped, the sound swallowed by the music. "You're gonna be the death of me," she whispered, her voice shaky, her fingers digging into his shoulders. "Then we'll go down together," he murmured, his lips brushing her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. The kiss deepened their bodies, swaying to the rhythm, the moonlight casting their shadows in a dance of light and dark. It was intimate, electric. But they pulled back, breathless, aware of the line they hadn't crossed, the promise of more, waiting for the right moment. The final test came at a community barbecue in Charleston, hosted at Coastal Soul's sister diner, a sprawling patio lit by string lights and filled with the smell of ribs and cornbread. Tasha had organized it, a celebration of the housing project's groundbreaking, and Elena had insisted Leonard come, a chance to bridge their worlds. Miss Ruby was there, her gospel voice leading a sing-along, her laughter warm as she hugged Elena. "You found your light, child," she said, her eyes twinkling. Jaden and Ethan ran through the crowd, their superhero capes flapping while Malik toasted Leonard with a beer, his grin wide. "You're one of us now, Carter," he said, clapping his shoulder. But the Charleston crowd wasn't all welcoming. A group of Leonard's business associates lingered by the bar, their whispers sharp, their eyes flicking to Elena with thinly veiled disdain. Carter's slumming it. One muttered loud enough for her to hear. "She's pretty, but she's not one of us." Elena's spine stiffened, her hand tightening around her glass, but she kept her smile, refusing to let them see her flinch. Leonard heard it too, and his face darkened, his hand finding hers under the table. "They don't matter," he said, his voice low, fierce. "You do." He stood, pulling her with him, and led her to the dance floor, the band striking up a soulful tune. The crowd watched, some with curiosity, others with judgment. But Leonard didn't care. He pulled her close, their bodies swaying, his eyes locked on hers. "You're mine, Elena," he whispered, his lips brushing her ear. "And I'm yours. Let him talk." She laughed, a sound that cut through the noise, and kissed him quick and fierce right there in front of everyone. The crowd faded, the music a heartbeat, and for a moment it was just them, two souls who'd found each other in a storm. Tasha whooped, raising her glass, and Miss Ruby's voice soared, a gospel hymn that felt like a blessing. Later on Wilmington's beach, they walked hand in hand. Ethan asleep in Leonard's arms, his head nestled against his shoulder. The moon hung low, its light dancing on the waves, and the air was cool, carrying the promise of fall. Elena stopped, her bare feet sinking into the sand, and looked at Leonard, her eyes soft but searching. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" she asked, her voice quiet, vulnerable. He set Ethan down gently on a blanket, then turned to her, his hands framing her face. "We're more than okay," he said, his voice steady, his eyes burning with love. "We're a family." He kissed her slow and deep, the waves, a soft chorus, the moonlight wrapping them in silver. Her hands slid under his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin, and she shivered the heat between them. A quiet fire. "I love you," she whispered, her voice husky, her lips brushing his. "I love you," he said, his forehead resting against hers, his hands tightening on her waist. The kiss lingered, a promise of forever, but they pulled back the weight of Ethan's sleeping form, grounding them. They sat together, the ocean before them, their hands entwined, and the stars above seemed to whisper back a quiet affirmation of the life they'd chosen. The future wasn't perfect. There would be storms, literal, and not Charleston's whispers, Elena's fears, Leonard's ghosts. But as they stood under the moonlight, Ethan's soft snores, a gentle rhythm, they knew they'd face them together. Love had brought them here through pain and fear, and love would carry them forward, a beacon in the dark. Hey, Soul Stories family, what a journey it's been with Leonard, Elena, and Ethan, finding love through the storms. If this heartfelt finale moved, you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with your favorite moment. Share this story with your friends, and let's keep spreading the warmth of love and family to everyone.